Well, good afternoon, Dr. Giles.
Good afternoon.
So let me introduce this interview. This interview is an extension of some interviews that was done at a retreat in Houston. Our Morehouse brethren got together at Wesley Plummer's ranch outside of Houston, the latter part of March, last part of April, to experience fellowship. And we were interviewed by Ernie Giles, who unfortunately was unable to participate in an interview. And so this interview is to make up for that. And so we are just delighted to make up for it in a way in which I get the opportunity to talk to him about things that he asked us. So let's get started. Are you ready? Okay, so let me start with the first question. Give me your name and nationality.
I am Earl Ernest Guile, Jr., and my nationality is American of African descent.
And what is your profession?
My profession, I have actually several professions that I have pursued. And the first and foremost is I am a doctor of dental medicine. And the second profession is epidemiologist. And the third profession is health consultant. And the fourth, I would say, in some sense, a writer.
So that's like four things that you have excelled in. So how did you arrive at all those different things? Give us an idea about your educational background that enabled you to do all those wonderful things.
Well, I want to go way back on that question to the time when I was 10 years old.
Okay.
And I was born and raised in Florence, South Carolina. And in the first 10 years of my life, I lived in the town. And I had a really wonderful childhood there. My cousins lived across the street, and I had friends in the neighborhood. At the age of 10, my family moved into the countryside. And I would say that was a pivotal moment in my life, because in the countryside, I didn't have the friends in the neighborhood that I had in town, and I had to create my own friends. And those friends became books. And I started a lot of reading, and that really, I think, has been very, very a fortunate set of circumstances for me, because it led to me being really a lifelong learner. And I think that has added a huge amount of value in my life. And so that really led to me deciding to go to college in Atlanta at Morehouse. And that was based on an experience I had listening to the president of Morehouse at the time, Benjamin Elijah Mays, who gave a baccalaureate address at Meharry Medical College graduation. I think it was around 1958. And in that speech, which was a speech he focused on the definition of happiness. And I was able to record that speech. I had just gotten a recorder, a tape recorder, which was a kind of a new technology at the time. And that tape recorder I took it to Nashville and recorded his speech. And when I got back to Florence, I played it over and over. I played it for my family and friends. And we were all just enthralled by the quality of the oratory that Dr. Mays provided. And I remember the key point he made in that speech, and the other part of that speech that was really inspiring was he quoted maybe 20 different philosophers in the process of presenting his case. And in the end, he said, if happiness is to be found, it is to be found in the struggle. And I thought that was a really powerful point of view. And so I decided to go to Morehouse. And that is where I got my bachelor's degree. And I was able to meet a lot of really interesting, intelligent, motivated people that really, was an environment where I operated like a sponge and absorbed as much as I could from it. And that experience at Morehouse, Morehouse provided me with the opportunities that really shaped my life. And I would list them. One was learning how to be a student and really establishing a protocol for study, which carried me well past Morehouse. And also Morehouse provided the opportunity for me to go to another college during my tenure there. And I spent a year at Bowdoin College in Maine as a result of Morehouse's having an exchange program with Bowdoin. And also Morehouse provided me the opportunity to go to work in a high-level research lab in cell biology at Oak Ridge National Laboratory during one of my summers between my junior and senior year. And also, when I graduated, Morehouse provided me the opportunity to join a program called Crossroads Africa. And I spent a summer working in a work camp in a village in Cameroon. And I would say that was probably one of the most significant events that I experienced as a result of Morehouse. And from that experience, I ended up spending a majority of my career overseas. When I was in Africa, I made a decision to pursue healthcare, and so and also public health. And so what I did after that, I matriculated at the University of Pennsylvania and acquired a Doctor of Dental Medicine degree. And subsequent to that, I got a public health degree in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley. And then after Berkeley, I came to Boston and I worked as a dental practitioner in a community health center. And while there, I actually decided to further my career in public health by doing a residency at Harvard University at the School of Dental Medicine there. And subsequent to that experience, I decided to take a gap year and go work overseas in the Far East. So I spent a year in Hong Kong, and there I was able to pursue several things in addition to sort of learning about a new culture and a new country. And in that motivation to travel came from the experience I had in Africa. I decided from that experience that I wanted to see a lot more of the world. And so I started out in the Middle East, in the Far East. And so after a year in Hong Kong pursuing acupuncture and actually martial arts, and also practicing dentistry, I came back to Boston and spent another couple of years there running a dental program in a program called Roxbury Medical and Dental Group. And from there, I spent, I I met my wife, and we traveled to Suriname, South America, and I joined the Ministry of Health there, working as an epidemiologist and as a dental practitioner, and also I taught dentistry to a program that was training dental nurses, which is a category of health personnel that we didn't have in the U.S. at the time. We have those in the U.S. now, but these are people who provide dental services because they had a very acute shortage of trained doctors in dentistry. And so after 3 years in Suriname, I left because they had a military coup, and I was very uncertain about the environment there for my family. In the meantime, during those 3 years, my 2 sons were born in Suriname, and from there, when the coup occurred, I decided to move back to the U.S. So that's when I first established a residence in Oregon, and so I pursued a career in Oregon, actually establishing a program for dental care for urban Indians in Portland, Oregon, and also I was assistant professor at Oregon Health Science University dental program, and so I was involved in a bit of teaching as well as providing dental services. After 3 years in Oregon, so you can see these 3-year periods, I decided with the family to go overseas again, and that's where I ended up in Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi Arabia, I was in King Saud University, and I think my presence there was actually establishing in a relatively new dental school, dental care from a public health perspective in a country that didn't have any programs in that field. And so I was a kind of a pioneer in that program, and during that tenure, I was able to establish something that was new in Saudi Arabia. We did an oral health survey that covered the entire country. We went into all the provinces, and we collected a sample of about 11,000 people, and we established a baseline of their dental health status. And that was done in conjunction with the program that the World Health Organization was doing in 6 or 7 other countries. So we used the same protocol that this World Health Organization program established to acquire this information from an epidemiological point of view of the dental health status of the residents of Saudi Arabia. And out of that study, as well as some other studies that I did while teaching at the university, I published 23 peer-reviewed papers in journals that were from 10 different countries, and also that was sort of I would say a capture of my career working overseas. And then I returned to the U.S. and became a health consultant, and in that capacity, I worked as a health reviewer, a medical care reviewer for community health centers, for the Health Services Resources Administration in HHS of the federal government. And that program was one where we evaluated the standards in community health centers in order for them to continue their funding from the government. These were federally qualified health centers and community health centers. And And so I traveled to about 21 states doing this, and in one foreign country, the foreign country that I went to doing an evaluation of medical care, as well as technical assistance to Palau, which is an island in the Western Pacific that is a relatively small island, but it's one of the islands that has some connection to the U.S. government. That's why we were able to do that. So that's sort of a summary of my career in my professional career, and so that is
well, let me ask you this, because that's an extensive list of things, but I want to take you back for a minute to maybe your earlier days at Morehouse and ask you about mentors, because you did mention one. You mentioned Dr. Mays. So were there others, either at Morehouse?
Well, there are two others that come to mind.
that you want to mention?
Dr. Roy Hunter.
Okay, go ahead.
My major at Morehouse was biological sciences, and Dr. Roy Hunter was my primary inspiration in biology. And I would say that Dr. Henry C. McVeigh was the other primary mentor. Of course, and he was a chemistry professor with a legendary reputation, and I would say that his course in particular is a course where I became confident that I was a relatively good student, and also it actually I learned the tools that I needed to have to pursue courses well beyond Morehouse, and he was also a person who I think inspired me about the sciences in general, and he, as well as Dr. Hunter, and I would say in the non-science areas, there are two people that I was mentored and were my teachers, were Professor Barksdale in English and also Professor Brisbane in political science. So those were my key mentors. But I'd have to add, Ron, that my peers at Morehouse were incredibly inspiring about a lot of things. You know, I learned one of the strategies that I always pursued in courses was I always looked around the class, and I did this everywhere I went after leaving Morehouse. I said, who's the smartest person in the room? I want to figure out what are they doing that I need to learn how to do.
Yeah, that's good advice. So let me ask you this. So outside of Morehouse, could you mention a couple of mentors that you had? You have such an extensive experience, both in the
Well, I would say my parents and my, we'll get into questions about my parents later, but an uncle that lived right next door to us was one of the first African-American attorneys in Florence. And he was always an inspiration. And, his career as he was a World War II veteran. He used to tell me these war stories about traveling he was in the Sicilian campaign and also the Italian campaign. And he talked about seeing the Vatican for the first time, and also he and as well as my parents were involved in the civil rights struggle, and so there were a lot of stories. One of the and so he was
let me
one
ask
of the
you
mentors.
this: since you brought up your parents, let's segue into that. Talk about your parents and how they influenced your development.
Okay, so as I was just saying, my parents were involved in the civil rights struggle. So
right.
I was always inspired by their involvement in that, and as well that they showed no fear about the consequences of being My father was the president of the NAACP in Florence for 17 years during the height of the civil rights movement. And so they inspired me from the point of view of the essential necessity of getting an education, you know. And it was kind of like a thing where it wasn't a question of going to college. It was only a question of where and when. And so, and it was kind of like instilled into me over the years, you know, because the messages that my family spoke about, you know, all the meals we had incredible discussions about life and how to navigate life, you know. And my mother had a habit of reading to us all the time. You know, she'd run across a magazine article and she'd read the whole article out to us out loud, you know. And so I acquired a lot of information from just their habits of reading. And my mother never went to college, and my father dropped out of college, but they both were self-educated. And my mother particularly was a voracious reader. And so she conveyed all the knowledge that she got to us, to me and my sister, you know, constantly. So that was really the major influence that my family and my parents provided me. And I think moving out to the countryside was also a gift that they gave to me inadvertently, because that's where I became, you know, a voracious reader, and it's benefited and, you know, added to the quality of my life, you know.
Well, you've mentioned your mother because you've written a book about your mother. So why don't we talk a bit about that? What inspired you to write that book?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. My mother was really involved in a lot of civic activities in addition to the civil rights movement. And she had gone to a meeting, a retreat, in one of the governmental committees that she was involved with in Florence. I think it was linked to the Florence government, city government. And she and my sister were there in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And they were on the way back from the beach, and they gave me a phone call. And they said that my mother had met one of the participants in this meeting, and she started telling this person her life story, so to speak. And this guy said, "This needs to be in a book," you know. And so my sister told me that while they were driving back from the meeting. And so it turns out that this was in about November, and my mother's 100th birthday was going to be February of the next year. So that's like 4 months away. And so immediately I went to work on this book. And luckily I was able to, you know, finish the book, publish it, and get it to all. When she celebrated her 100th birthday, we had 300 people in Florence at the Civic Center celebrating her birthday. And I was able to pass out a copy of the book to everybody who came to that meeting.
What's the title of the book?
The title of the book is A Lady of Grace, Genius, and Grit. And actually, I have the book here.
Yeah, hold it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read the book. It's a wonderful book. And we could just do an interview on the book and your mother, but we don't have time to do that. But I can attest to the fact that it's a wonderfully written book, and it's a wonderful story about your mother. But let's move on to, I want to ask you a question about, just back to Morehouse for a minute. You remember what Mays said at our graduation, that we were entering a world that's going to be different than the one in which we started at Morehouse in 61. So I have a kind of hypothetical for you. If the world had not integrated, if we hadn't been exposed to a desegregated world, what do you think would have been your opportunities? Or what would you have imagined your trajectory in life to be if the world had been still segregated when you graduated from Morehouse?
Now, that's a very interesting hypothetical. I would say that I would have certainly taken to heart one of the points that Dr. Mays made in the charge to our class, was that even though we might be in a segregated society, we did not have to have segregation in our minds. We could be free in our minds. And I would say that that would be the kind of approach that I would take to things. And one of the things that I think would probably not have changed in my career is because the rationale that I took from my experience of working, of going to Africa, in an early part of my life, was that the world was extended beyond the US borders. And I was also committed to working in different parts of the world, particularly the developing world. And so people would say, well, why don't you go back to Florence, South Carolina and open a dental practice? And so I said to myself, I said, well, you say that I need to work in my own backyard. Well, I think the world is my backyard, And so
Yeah.
that probably would have been the course of my trajectory, in spite of the fact that we were in a segregated society. And actually, Ron, one of the things that we got to recognize is that in spite of, how should we say, the huge disadvantages of segregation, there were some advantages. Namely, we both, probably grew up in segregated schools. The fact that we had Black teachers motivating us and telling us things that was not on the curriculum was a very important part of our life. And I think a lot of African-American students in this day and age don't get that. And we were fortunate, in spite of, a segregated setup, to get that wisdom from African-American teachers.
Okay, so here we are at the precipice of this new integrated world in 1965. So what obstacles did you overcome after that, since you went into a sort of a new situation after you left Morehouse?
It's interesting about obstacles. It's really interesting question. I really did not experience any serious obstacles, but I would say I did have to fortify my motivation. And so as an internal obstacle, that low motivation is something that can really curtail a person's possibilities of optimizing their potential. I recognized early on that motivation was a very important element of things, and I certainly worked on that in terms of strengthening that internal engine that would let me pursue things. I would say that obviously in the USA, with an infrastructure that I would say that has a racist component to it, I, as many other African Americans, have experienced racism, in job applications and in the pursuit of things that were integral to my career. And one of the fortunate things that I experienced when I went working overseas was that I didn't experience racism. So for years that I was working overseas, I didn't really live in the cloud of what the average African American lives day to day, in their lives within the U.S. And so that was a very liberating kind of experience for me, to be in a place where people respected me from my education, and they respected me as an American in particular. And that was something that I was very appreciative of.
That's interesting. So, so your preparation for this work that you gravitated toward, do you credit Morehouse or other experiences for preparing you for obviously a life living abroad?
Well, I think, yeah, Morehouse certainly was key, the people at Morehouse in particular, that was key to my life in so many ways. And so we always think about the formative periods as being pivotal, and certainly that was the case with Morehouse. And there probably are so many things that I got out of Morehouse that are in my subconscious that I don't even realize. and I think that like I explained earlier, all of the opportunities that I've had in terms of a variety of experiences and situations, they actually originated in Morehouse. So for example, the fact that Morehouse had these links to other institutions like Oak Ridge and Bowdoin, for me, that made me think about the same thing when I went to other institutions. For example, at the University of Pennsylvania, when I was a student there, they had a program for research that was typically done in the summer months with a lab at Penn. Now, because of the experience I had at Morehouse at Oak Ridge, I met a Finnish embryologist, and I kept contact with him. And so I went to the person running this research program at Penn and asked them, okay, I know this program is for finding a lab at Penn to work in. Can I find a lab in another country? And so he said, give me a letter and it's good to go. You're good to go. So I actually wrote the guy in Finland, and he said, yeah, you can come here. And as a result, I was able to spend 2 summers at the University of Helsinki in the Laboratory of Experimental Embryology with a researcher named Jussi Cohen. And that was a kind of idea that I got from Morehouse that, hey, I don't have to think in the box. I can think outside of the box.
Right. Let me ask
you.
So
I was able to. So just briefly on that experience, I took the grant was $600. So I took $600 and I bought an airline ticket for $289 that were on Icelandic Airlines that took me through Iceland and landed in Luxembourg. Then I had to get a train to Copenhagen and a flight from Copenhagen to Helsinki. And I spent a whole summer on a $600 grant. And in the last month of the summer, I hitchhiked around Europe. I flew down to Istanbul, and I caught a train from Istanbul all the way back to Paris.
You are my role model for a world-class interloper. So what do you credit that in your background, that you want to experience different cultures, and you have that embedded in you more than anybody I know. So who do you give credit for that? How that come?
Well, I give credit to moving to the countryside when I was 10 years old, because I started reading. Geography was one of my favorite subjects, and I used to collect maps. I think one of the I think Esso, it's now Exxon. They used to have free maps at the filling stations, and I used to collect all these maps and I write for maps, and they'd send me maps in the mail, and I used to read books on geography. One of the other experiences I had in growing up in Florence that also was a part of me being interested in not only books but just the world in general was at the time of the sit-ins, we had a group in Florence go and they had a sit-in at Crest, which was the five and dime store in Florence, and they got arrested and so on, and they had a big trial, and so I missed that group for some reason. I think I was training for the track team, and I missed being in the sit-in. But I had a friend one day we were walking home from school, and I said, "Now they don't allow us to go to the library here. Why don't we go and try to integrate the library?" So actually, we strolled in just on the spur of the moment, and we were trying to. So we went in and we tried to check out some books. And so they wouldn't allow us to do it. They said, "No, you're not allowed to do that here." And we said, "Well, why?" And we were querying them. and so we got some books from the stacks, and we sat down and we started reading while we were there. And the library reached the closing time, which is 6 p.m. And they came over to our table and said, "Well, we're closing now. You guys have to leave." We said, "Well, we don't want to leave until you give us a card and let us check out these books." And they said, "No, we can't do that." And so we said, "Well, we're going to stay here until you do that." And so sure enough, the lady said, "Well, we're going to have to call the police." So they did call the police, and then in 5 minutes, I saw the lights outside, the red and blue lights twirling. And the police came, I think 2 policemen came in, and they said, "Boys, you got to leave." And we said, "No, we want to get a library card. Why can't we get a library card?" They said, "Well, the library is closed now, and if you don't leave, we're going to have to arrest you and take you to jail." So we said, so me and my friend Henry, we huddled, and we said to ourselves, "Well, why don't we just come back tomorrow and try it again?" So we left without getting arrested, right? And so we came back the next day, and when we got to the library, we saw a sign on the door saying "Closed for renovation." And we kept coming back every day to check. And sure enough, it was closed for a couple of months. So from, I think, late November, early December, when we first went, we went back on February 22nd, I remember the date, was George Washington's birthday. And sure enough, the library was open. We went in, and we asked the lady, "Can we get a library card now?" She forms, we filled them out, and we got library cards. And so it's interesting. I went back to the library just recently, within the last year, and it's a really big. It's a new building now, huge, very nice library. And so I went to the historic room, and I asked them. I said, "Is there any record here of African Americans coming to the library to try to use it, back in the 60s?" And so sure enough, this lady provided me with minutes from a meeting, it was the history of the library that one of the board members had written. And in that, when I went through this archive of the library's history, they mentioned that two Black boys came in determined to get a library card back in the exact same time when we did it. And what happened was it threw the whole library structure into disarray because it was a part of the school system, and they were using the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling to keep the library segregated. And so as a result of us going there, and I didn't find this out until, like I said, within the last year, that they had to change the whole structure of the library. They had to get off. They were not a part of the school system anymore, and it became an independent board, and they had to get a new board and everything. And I didn't know, at the time, we didn't know any of that had happened, right? And so then what I did was I wrote them a letter, and I explained who we were, and I told them, and I explained what our rationale was for going to the library and how it affected our lives. And I told them, make sure you include this description of our point of view of integrating the library in the history of the library. And so they wrote me back and said that they would definitely include my description of what happened and put it into the notes, into the history.
So although you were traveling the world, you took time out to get married and to start a family, and you have children. You want to talk about that?
Sure, of course. I would say that has probably been the most significant part of how I view my life, is my experience with family. And so I'll go forward to some of the questions that are later to be asked, and talk about, how I met my wife and so on.
Sure, go ahead.
Do you want me to pursue it
Yes.
that way, or?
Yeah, we're sort of in the family section of the questionnaire. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was very keen to having grown up in a two-parent family and learning how important it was for two people to be together. I was very determined that I would be very careful and very extensive in my pursuit of a family, right? And a wife in particular. And so one of the things that I learned from my family was that, and we were able to trace our family back several generations. And I learned the importance of family and how significant that was. So I was wondering a while, would this be compatible with the goal that I have of working abroad, and would I find someone who was, was good with that? And so, and also, I also got advice from Mays. You remember Mays told us, he said, look, make sure you get as many degrees as you can before you get married. I don't know if you remember that, right?
I don't remember that one.
yeah, that was one of the things he said in chapel, man, on Tuesday mornings. Right?
Is that right?
He said, get as many degrees as you can get before you get married. So I was kind of late to the game of getting married. I'd already, done a lot of traveling on my own, backpacking and so forth around Europe. I did a lot of travels. After the Crossroads, I did another trip to Africa, and while I was at Harvard, actually, I did a trip to evaluate the dental programs in East Africa. So I started out in Kenya, went down by bus from Nairobi to Dar es Salaam, through and I visited Serengeti and the Gorogoro crater, all those key places in East Africa. And then I crossed Tanzania to Lake Tanganyika, took a boat to Congo, went through the Congo with a lot of difficulty because they didn't have any public transportation. I had to hitchhike. I found some missionaries and I hitchhiked with them into Uganda. Then while Idi Amin was in charge, and then I went across Uganda and I did a circle all the way back to Nairobi. So I covered a lot of East Africa. And so all of this was, a result of things that I was doing before getting married, right? That's the whole point. So I met my wife. It was interesting. I'd already spent a year in the Far East in Hong Kong. And so I knew a lot about Asian culture as a result of that experience. And so I was back in Boston and I was driving down the street and listened to the radio in my Volkswagen Beetle, that I drove across the country twice, by the way.
Okay.
So while I was listening to this radio, they said they were going to have an all-women's conference at the Elmer Lewis Center this Saturday. And the first thing that came to my mind was, will they let me in? So I actually went to this all-women's conference. It was like a celebration of International Working Women's Day on March 8th. And I went to this conference, and sure enough, they let me in, right? And I think I looked around, and there was only one other guy in the whole room with all these women, right? I started walking around and looking around. I met some people I knew because there was prior to me going to the Far East, I had been doing martial arts. I've been doing Kung Fu, right? And I met some people when I was doing Kung Fu, and they were and one of the ladies that I met doing Kung Fu was at this conference. And so I got into this long conversation with her, and she was with two other friends. And so it turns out that, they had a seat near her. So I sat with them, right? Because I knew her. And so the conference was ongoing, everything. But anyway, the friend that was sitting next to her, I looked at her and said, yeah, okay. So I started talking with this friend of a friend, right? And that was the person that became my wife, and so.
Was there long courtship, or did you get married right away, or what happened?
Well, we met, and within a fairly short time, she was doing a master's in social work at Boston University, and her brother was opening a bookstore in New York. She grew up in New York. She came to the US when she was 4 years old from Hong Kong, and she grew up in New York. And her brother was opening a bookstore in Chinatown in New York. And she had promised her brother after graduating that she was going to help him start the bookstore. So we met and we were dating for maybe 2 or 3 months. And actually, within those 2 or 3 months, she moved in, we moved in, we were living together. And then she had to go back to New York. And so she had promised her brother several months till the bookstore got started and was well up and running. And so after maybe 6 months, she moved back to Boston. And so we were together in Boston for maybe 2 years, maybe less than 2 years, about a year and a half. And then I told her that I wanted to work in South America. And so I convinced her to go to Suriname with me. And so we went to Suriname, and that's where we got married, actually. We got married, and the whole thing, the whole ceremony was in Dutch, which is the language that they spoke in Suriname. And that's where we started our family. In the beginning, we couldn't find a resident because Suriname had just gotten its independence from Holland, and they didn't have enough accommodations. So we actually had to live in a motel for like about 4 months. It was really, really a tough beginning. And eventually the government got us a house and on the eastern border with French Guyana in a small village called Albina. And this village was where we were able to establish our first household. And this village was so small that, you know, they just had like a dry goods store with a few things. We had to travel 90 miles and cross 2 rivers where we had to put the car on a ferry to get to the capital, Paramaribo, to do our shopping. And so every 2 weeks we would go and put up and these rivers that we crossed, these were rivers that if you throw a breadcrumb in the water, the piranhas would come and do a feeding frenzy. So these rivers were infested with piranhas. And also the other interesting thing about living in this village was that we was like a Peace Corps thing that we sort of organized ourselves, right? So we used to travel across to French Guyana, which they didn't have any border controls, but they had these guys that had these dugout canoes on this. It was a very wide river separating Suriname from French Guyana. And we would get on these dugout canoes and cross over to the French side. And this is the place where they had one of the penal colonies. That the French had a penal colony in French Guyana. And so we'd go over there and get we get the wines and the cheeses and stuff and come back over to Albina by dugout canoe. And also, while I was there, we used to go to the Amerindian villages. This was part of my work. And I would do evaluations of the Amerindians. And I did one of the first research projects in Suriname to evaluate oral health conditions there as well. And so we'd go to these Amerindian villages, and people in these villages that we went to, the Amerindians were like, you know, the ones you find in the middle of the Amazon. Well, in fact, most of Suriname is the Amazon. You know, most of the country is rainforest, right? And so they slept in hammocks. These people living in these villages. So anyway, that was how my family got started. And when the coup occurred about 3 years later, my oldest son was about 2 years old. And my second son was a baby, was about 6 months old. And that's when we moved to Oregon. And that's when I came. I had to come before that and take the board exam and all that stuff in order to get a license to practice dentistry. And that's when we came and set up our program. So family.
No, I was going to ask you, let me interrupt there. So you have 2 sons?
Yes.
Okay, and what are their ages at the moment?
Okay. 43 and 44.
So are they taking after you? Do they want to travel the world, or are they as interested in other cultures as you are?
Yeah, well, actually, that was a part of their growing up experience. You know, while they were growing up in Saudi Arabia, mainly in Riyadh, I lived in 3 different parts of Saudi Arabia over several years. We did 5 round the world trips while they were growing up. Basically, when I was a professor at the university, King Saud University, we got a ticket for the whole family to go back to Oregon every year during the summer. And I was able to convert that ticket to a round the world ticket. And so I did that 5 times. And we would, and basically the rules back then is, as long as you can link it with several airlines and you can go in one direction around the world. You couldn't backtrack. And so you would just pick capitals and you didn't have to confirm reservations. You could just pick out your route and just go to the airport and get on the plane. That's how it worked in those days.
So what you're saying,
so the 2 sons,
they didn't have any choice.
Traveling.
They didn't have any choice but to be a world traveler.
Right. They grew up traveling, right.
Right.
And they were, when they had to go to boarding school from the 9th grade forward, from the 10th grade forward. And so when they got to boarding school in the US, they would never tell their peers about all the travels they did. They were like stealth-like, they were very quiet about their experiences.
What are their, let me ask you that, what are their names?
My oldest son is Mark, and the youngest is Jeffrey.
Mark and Jeffrey? Yes. So what are they doing now?
So Mark is he went to one of the top boarding schools, Andover, Phillips Academy, Andover, and from there he went to MIT, and he graduated from MIT with a degree in mechanical engineering. And after MIT, he went to University of Pennsylvania, my old school, but he went to the business school, Wharton, and he got an MBA in finance. And he's now living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and working at a bank there in investment banking. And my youngest son, he went to another boarding school, Choate Rosemary Hall in Connecticut. And from there, he went to Williams College in Massachusetts. And unfortunately, he became ill and he had to drop out of college when he was at Williams. And he's now a photographer, and he pursues photography in North Carolina as well.
I see. So you've had such an interesting experience, and I know it's a sad part of your life was when your wife passed, and I know that that's difficult to talk about, but since this is for posterity, do you want to say anything about your wife?
Of course.
Go ahead.
My wife was a rock for me all those years, and actually, as I grieve her loss, which was less than a year ago, on July 16th, 2021, she was the person who I met in Boston, and she was courageous and adventuresome enough to travel with me to live in South America when she had a brilliant career ahead of her to be in the US. And for all of the years that we've been together, she has been the most loyal and family and, devoted spouse that anyone could have. And not only that, but she's brilliant. I mean, everything she pursued, excellence came out of it, as a key example. Okay, so she had a degree, couple of examples. And she had a degree in a master's in social work, and she also got a master's. And one of the things that really brought us together was that she got 2 degrees from Boston University. She got a degree in African American studies as
really?
Well. And so she had a master's.
But she wasn't. Was she African American?
No, she was Chinese American.
Chinese American. And she got a degree in African American studies.
Right.
That's
One of her advisors was an African American lady at Boston University, and she convinced her that she could get a second degree in the same time period that she got her social work degree. And so she enrolled in both programs on that lady's advice. And so that was one of the things that when we, met, that was, very instrumental in us having a bond. And so, but so when we went to Suriname, for example, she didn't do any social work because the language was Netherlands, Dutch. But I met a really nice doctor while I was there, who was really one of the key persons that really helped us integrate into Suriname life. While I was telling you about us living in this motel, while we were in this motel, this guy came out of the blue to the motel and said he heard that there was an American couple here and he wanted to meet us. So we met this guy, Minka, Hank Minka. He's a dermatologist. And he says, not only am I want to meet you, but I want to introduce you to some of my friends. So he invited us to his house. And he had a party with about 20 people at his house. And he introduced my wife and I to these professionals in Suriname. And he has become a lifelong friend. I've been in contact with him to this day. Anyway, he was able to get my wife a job in the dermatology department at the Ministry of Health, where he was working. And so my wife became a statistician, and she was collecting data on all of the dermatological diseases. And, in the tropics, there's a lot of stuff that they deal with, including leprosy. And so she created a registry for leprosy while she was there. And so that was the key thing that she did in Suriname. When we were in Saudi Arabia, she, in addition to really being a wonderful mother for our children, she started working in the hospital that was a part of the university hospital. And in the beginning, she worked for the head of the radiology department, and she basically ran the department. And she actually edited a lot of the head of the department's papers that led to him becoming a professor. Anyway, the dean of the college heard about her, and he said, I need this lady. I want to start a journal. So he called my wife in and said, I want to start this journal. And the dean was a cardiologist. And so Anne became the managing editor of the Journal of the Saudi Heart Association. And she managed that journal for 10 years, basically until we left Saudi Arabia to come back to the US. And during those 10 years, she edited every paper that was in each journal. It had 7 or 8 papers. She edited all those papers that were submitted to the journal for publication. And these were mostly non-English speakers that were submitting papers. So you can imagine the level of the grammar that would be coming to her. And basically when she would edit a paper, it would be like red marks everywhere. Now, she's not an English major and she was not a trained editor. She got books on editing and she learned all of the marks that editors use. She learned it on her own, and she became an incredible editor. And I would say that was probably one of the premier achievements, in addition to raising our 2 sons. That was one of the premier achievements of her life. In addition to being the best spouse that one could have.
Well, you know, since this is so recent, I hesitate to ask you about grief, but any advice about how you manage grief and how you manage to deal with the grief of the loss of your wife?
Yeah, that's a good question. So everybody manages grief in their own way, right? And I would say that my first experience with grief was when my father passed in 1980. And what happened was I was in Suriname at the time, and he was ill with congestive heart failure. And 2 weeks before he passed, I had traveled back to North Carolina, where he was at Duke and in the hospital there. And I visited him in the hospital. And then I went back to Suriname because he had been ill for a while. I had made a decision to move back to the US, and that's when we were moving to Oregon. And so I was in the process of trying to move from Suriname back to the US. And so 2 weeks after I had visited him, I got a call from my mother telling me that he passed. And because of the flight situation coming out of Suriname, which didn't have a lot of flights, I couldn't get there in time for the funeral. So I was not able to attend the funeral for my father. And so that was really, that added to the grief, if you will, of the situation. And so it was a pretty, and also I was trying to move out of Suriname, hacking and all that. It was just a really very, very difficult period. And one of the things that consoled me to a certain extent was I met this Chinese doctor who had moved to Suriname, and he had left China. His family moved to Taiwan, and then he had moved to South America, to Suriname. And so we knew him in the family. And when I was talking to him about not being able to go to my father's funeral, he said, well, I'm gonna tell you my situation. He said, my father passed in China, and I didn't even know about it for about 20 or 30 years. 20 years later, I found out that he passed. It was that. And so that was one of the things that would say, well, there are situations where people have much worse situations than I have. So that was a bit consoling. But then one of the ways in which I've dealt with grief, particularly most recently with my wife, is that I've just focused on all of the times that we had together and all of the things that we did, all of the shared experiences that we had, and just the strength of our love for each other, and how so much of her is a part of me, particularly this idea of pursuing excellence, in whatever you do. Try to do the best you can. And I think I learned a lot of that before meeting her, but I learned a lot more after meeting her, just the way she dealt with things.
Well, that's a wonderful testimonial to your relationship with your wife. Let's move to larger questions outside of family. Well, before I do that, I want to ask you about hobbies, which have a way of consoling one, I guess, if you're going through a difficult period. What hobbies do you have, and how important have they been?
Well, I would say my hobbies have been focused on reading, as you might guess, which started primarily when I was around 10, 11 years old. I really got into books. So if you look around my house, I've got an incredible amount of books that I've accumulated over the years. And I have, I'm an avid library visitor. So that's a big hobby. Traveling is another huge hobby of mine.
How could we miss that? I mean, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
I counted up the countries. I've been to about 63 countries.
That's amazing. Well, let me ask you this, because along with reading books, you've written how many? 5 books?
Yeah, I'll get to that. Let me finish the other hobbies that I have.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So I also have focused on an idea about the science of longevity, and as a result of so here's my logic about that. I made a conclusion years ago that if there's a subject that I study intensely based on what I've learned going to graduate school, studying epidemiology, which is a measurement science. I learned a lot of ability to read peer-reviewed literature. And I taught that a lot to my students when I was teaching over the years. A big part of what I taught was you got to be able to look at peer-reviewed literature and understand what they're saying, understand the statistics and so on. So I decided that, so what area can I study that would give me a big benefit? And I concluded that what is the area of research about aging and longevity? And that is something that the literature has really exploded over the last 2 decades. And I've been really on top of it in reading, and I've written an article and given lectures on it as well. And so from that knowledge that I've gained out of studying about longevity, that has really had a huge influence on my lifestyle, particularly the diet that I pursue and the exercise that I pursue. So a part of my hobbies are running, swimming, biking, resistance training, Tai Chi, Qigong, Kung Fu. And so I pursue all of these things pretty much on a daily basis. I sort of, for say, biking and running, I alternate from day to day. And so as a result of this, so I pursue a diet that focuses on caloric restriction. And caloric, just to give a definition of that, it's caloric restriction with optimal nutrition. In other words, you restrict the amount of calories you take on a daily basis, but at the same time, it's a plant-based diet primarily. I'm not exclusively vegan or vegetarian, but the preponderance of what I eat are plants, right? So I combine that with the regimen that I have in terms of exercise, and I'm convinced that it's paid off. You know, I haven't had how should we say? Well, I have had a serious health issue. Namely, I've endured cancer, and that's another story that I can talk about a little bit. But apart from that, at my age, I feel as good as I've ever felt in terms of just how I feel about the regime that I have pursued and how it has benefited me. And the point that's key, Ron, is that it's benefited everything that I do. You know, from out of all of the exercise I do and out of all of the diet that I pursue, I think it makes me, you know, pursue other things at a level that I probably couldn't pursue otherwise. without that, and so that has really been something that I'm so happy that I decided to pursue this idea of longevity. And I remember King made a statement that sort of resonated. He said something about longevity has its place, but in his life, he did not experience longevity.
Yeah. Right.
He died at the age of 39.
Right.
And one of the things that Mays used to always talk about is all these people that died at young ages and how much they did before they died, right? And we were able to meet King when we were at Bowdoin, six Morehouse students. We met King. He came there to give a speech, and he was there, and he heard about Morehouse students being there, so he met with us privately. And so that was a meeting that I'll always remember, and he was giving us this profound advice about what we should do while we were in Maine, where Bowdoin is, and how we should educate people about the civil rights movement and get their buy-in and support for it. And so that we actually traveled around the churches in Maine and gave talks and explained what was happening in the South. And he was doing that when he was like 35 years old. And I was saying, wow, look at all he did before the age of 39. It blows. Say, what is our excuse, right?
Another one of my hobbies is writing. I decided years ago that it would be an interesting project to come up with ideas for books and try to put them together. And it's been quite a challenge, as well as something that I have benefited enormously from, because all of them required me to do research and to put together the prose that would hopefully be entertaining to the reader. The first book I wrote was a book about my two sons and their education. And this was a book about my oldest son getting admitted to MIT as an undergraduate. He subsequently studied there and acquired a degree in mechanical engineering. Fortunately, this particular book was also translated into Chinese and sold in China. This is the Chinese edition of that book. And on a visit to China, I toured a bookstore in Shanghai and found it on the shelf there. The second book I wrote was a book that I started writing probably in the late 70s. And this book is a book about climate change. And it's a novel, and it hopefully talked about what humanity needed to do to mitigate the issue of climate change. I published this particular book in 2005, and this was well before climate change has become the dramatic issue that it is today. The third book that I wrote is a book of interviews that I did using some of the same questions that are on this particular interview. And this particular book is a collection of interviews from people from all the continents except Antarctica. And the hypothesis that I had for this particular book was that if you look at human societies around the globe, that even though there are differences in the culture, for example, at the core, there's many similarities in terms of the aspirations that people have for their children, the aspirations they have to get an education, the aspirations they have for a better world. And I tried to capture that in these interviews so that if you see the interviews of people from the Far East, for example, they would have similar desires as people from North America or from Europe or from South America or from Africa. So this is a book of interviews, and the fourth book that I wrote is a book called The Singularity Prize. And this is a book about artificial intelligence. It's a novel. And the idea in this novel is that artificial intelligence will be coming. And it's already here, in fact. And that we need to be particularly careful as to how that artificial intelligence evolves. And in the theme of this book is that a team of scientists, one group in US and one group in China, are racing to win this prize that will be given to them when they develop a system of artificial intelligence that surpasses human intelligence, that is embedded with ethical codes that will make it beneficial to humanity. The fifth book that I wrote is a book that is a memoir about the life that my mother has led. This was written just prior to her turning 100 and becoming a centenarian. I was able to present this book to 300 people who came to celebrate her 100th birthday, and it details the things that occurred in her life that are quite notable and impressive. She is now, as of 2022, 104 years old and is doing well. A book that I edited along with my wife's help is a book that was developed on a project that I worked on to establish a research-based university along the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. The name of this university is KAUS, and just prior to the start of this university, the university had a symposium on the 21st Century Research University, and I was able to collect all of the speeches and edit them and put them in this particular publication. So that concludes my hobby of writing.
Right. Well, let me ask you, because you're really close to answering the question, the next question, and that is, what is happiness? You kind of alluded to that in your regime of things you do on a daily basis, but you want to expand on that a minute?
Yeah, well, I would say that happiness is a spectrum, right? every day you wake up and you look around and say, wow, I feel okay, I'm breathing. That should be a happy day. And so I put happiness even at the really small things. And one of the things I link to happiness very strongly is gratitude. Being so thankful for whatever advantages you have, in life, and recognizing that it's not all peaches and cream. There's going to be, heartache, and there's going to be pain, and so on. But that's all a part of the landscape that you have to accept. And so I think that happiness is your perception of the place you are in life and the advantages you have. And even those persons who are homeless and on the street, there can be happiness there because they're still alive, right? And they could be in a mansion, another year, or, that's possible, that could happen. So my concept of happiness is very, very broad. And I think that a person should really tune in on the small things and be appreciative of them, celebrate any victories you have, and savor them, think about them, and just let it marinate as if you were putting a red coloring dye in a solution and how it spreads over the water. Let it radiate and marinate through you. The things that you have in life that make your life worth living.
So in a world where we're experiencing so many conflicts, that's good advice to focus on the small things, but not lose perspective. So one of the questions, and this is your question that you asked all of us, and I'm sure you reflected on this. What are your major concerns for the world of the 21st century, and what solutions do you propose?
Well, for sure, the 21st century is different from the 20th century and the 19th century. And in this particular century, I would say that my most significant concern is climate change. And the reason I say that is because, not to say that there are not other issues, but I think all the other issues will be in the context of climate change. And that is something that it is so urgent that human civilization must address. The other part of the concern that I have that's in the context of climate change is the kind of shift away from democracy that's occurring in many parts of the world, including the United States, and how that could have a very pernicious impact on people's lives going forward. For example, the world that George Orwell described in 1984 can actually happen. And there are elements of it even in the present construct of things. And so I think that in order to have a world where our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren can have a viable, I think the present civilization and the people in it have to really focus on mitigating climate change, to put all of our brain power and our resources to solve this issue, because if we don't, I think it's an existential threat. It's an extinction event, in fact. If if there's runaway greenhouse effect, and we get to something called a wet bulb temperature, where people cannot really survive because of the heat, then our civilization is doomed, you know? And so why aren't we addressing this as with the urgency that it requires? And so one of the parts of that question, as I recall, is that what are my solutions for all of this? Well, I would say that the first thing we've got to do is we've got to do a lot more research on climate change and how we can not only go to zero emissions, and as the experts say by 2050, but we have to also take carbon out of the atmosphere and methane out of the atmosphere and go back to pre-industrial levels so that the climate can be more stable. Right now, for example, in Oregon, this morning, I'm waking up, it's in the 40s, and it's in the middle of May. It's been the coldest spring that I've observed in Oregon since I've lived here. And that's an unusual weather pattern. And the droughts that they're having in the Southwest and the intensity of the storms, the hurricanes and the cyclones and the that they're having in the Far East, in the Indian Ocean and so on. These are testimonies to what the realities are, and so climate change is already with us and is something that we definitely need to address. And beyond those two things, the other key thing that I've been studying about is artificial intelligence. And you remember you asked the question at the reunion about, well, how would we deal with an alien civilization and their intelligence if they made contact with Earth? Well, we are already in the process of getting an alien intelligence, which is artificial intelligence. There are so many things that artificial intelligence are doing already that we don't really know how they come up with these, how it's like a black box that we don't know what's going on inside. They come up with certain points of view in natural language processing and in computational stuff, and we don't know what their logic is and how they are doing it. And that's going to get worse and worse, especially as artificial intelligence improves recursively and become very soon, definitely according to the experts, AI will be smarter than one human. And shortly after that, it'll be smarter than all humans combined. So that's the kind of world we are really anticipating within our lifetime that we need to really be prepared for. And so what's the problem? The problem is an AI that has an intelligence superior to humans without an ethical basis to its function, where it has its own goal structures that are separate from what humans need and what goals that humans have. We could have a huge problem in civilization when that occurs. So we need to be preparing for that. And we need to definitely infuse in the coding for this AI that's emerging, ethical codes that actually surpass humans. Because we know that humans have a lot of flaws in our ethics, right? Even though we've made a lot of advances, according to Steven Pinker in a book called The Angels of Our Nature, he talks about how, if you look at the news on a day-to-day basis, you would think that things are going to hell in a handbasket. But in reality, if you go back several centuries, the world is way better off today than it was 300 years ago in terms of mortality from wars and violence, from human to human violence. It's a whole lot less now than it was back in the past. And the trend should continue if, if civilization does things right, and if we are able to have an AI that is very beneficial to society and human civilization, and it's not going to destroy human civilization, but it's going to make life much better, where people don't have to work because AI is going to do all the work. People will just pursue creative pursuits like painting, music, writing, and the other forms of art, of the arts.
My favorite books, I would like to introduce you to just a few of them. One is a book written by the president of the college that I attended, Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. And I was fortunate to get his signature and a note that he wrote for me on a unannounced visit that I made to his house in Atlanta, Georgia. He welcomed me into his office, and we had a very interesting chat when I described about the progress I had made subsequent to Morehouse of attending the University of Pennsylvania, the University of California, Berkeley, and at that time I was a clinical fellow at Harvard University. The title of the book is Born to Rebel, Benjamin Elijah Mays. Another book that has been very inspiring to me, and was also inspiring to Nelson Mandela, and this is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. He was a philosopher, emperor of Roman Empire, and he was known as one of the good emperors. And he put some very interesting insights of his into this small, short book of his meditations. Another book that I've been inspired by is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And it's a book of Chinese philosophy that explains the basic tenets of Taoism, which is known more as a philosophy in China than a religion. Another book that I've been inspired by is The Singularity is Near. And this is a book where the author is one of the premier inventors in America, a graduate of MIT, and he talked about the inevitability of a point when artificial intelligence will reach human intelligence and rapidly exceed that. And this is the book that inspired me to write my novel entitled The Singularity Prize. Another book that I've been very inspired by is this book called The Men of Mark, and the subtitle is Eminent, Progressive, and Rising. And it's a book written by a Charlestonian, South Carolinian in 1887. And in it, he gives biographies of African Americans who, many of them lived during slavery and came out of slavery and made significant achievements in their lives. And it was a very inspiring book because I knew the challenges, I learned about the challenges that they faced in Reconstruction and Jim Crow that came right after Reconstruction, after 1876. And one of the scholars that I have been most inspired by is W.E.B. Du Bois. And this is a book which has a collection of his writings. And he was one of the early of first graduates of Harvard to get a PhD. And he's written voluminously about the question of race in America. And he famously said that the problem of the 20th century will be a problem of the color line. And it turns out that this is probably going to be the problem of the 21st century as well. Anyway, in this collection of writings is one of his famous works, The Souls of Black Folks. So those are some of the books that I have been inspired by. In response to the question of my retirement plans and my philosophy of retirement, well, I don't really believe in retirement as such. And I have significant goals during this period of my life. And one of the large goals that I have is to help to establish a science research institute that would be linked to, hopefully, the college I attended, Morehouse, or a large university. And this research institute would be on land that was passed down in my family in South Carolina. And the idea for this institute would be one that would pursue research in three particular areas. One would be climate change, which is one of the most pressing issues facing human civilization. And if we do not solve and mitigate this crisis that's already upon us and getting worse by the day, it could potentially be an extinction event for human society. Analogous to the extinction event of an asteroid that plummeted to Earth 66 million years ago and caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. So I think that this research institute could be quite instrumental in helping humanity solve this pressing problem. At the moment, we are having incredibly extreme weather events, hurricanes, typhoons in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, cyclones that are much more severe than ones we've known previously. We are having mega droughts, for example, in the southwest of the US and in parts of Africa. We are also having fires that are coming out of extreme drought and strong wind conditions in tinderbox areas. And we have lost enormous amounts of the forests in the Amazon from fires. And the Amazon, as we know, is an important carbon sink for the world. It draws enormous amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, helping us to maintain a stable climate. But as that forest disappears, we will have more and more problems of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and their contribution to a runaway greenhouse effect, which will increase the temperatures on the earth, and it will cause a rising sea levels from the melting glaciers and melting ice in the polar regions. And this will dramatically change the coastline all around the world. So I think that more research is needed, and I would like to help that process by getting a research institute established. The other area of research that this institute could pursue would be health innovation, which is important because we know that the health of any society is critical to its long-term security and the way in which it can be productive and be a society that would have people who are healthy and it would contribute highly to the quality of life. So if we could have more research on how we can innovate in health and use the technologies and the knowledge that we have gained from laboratory research and put it into practice, we can have a much healthier society. At the moment, in the US, for example, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension are three of the major causes of morbidity. And these are medical issues that can be mitigated through research. Furthermore, it is now being understood that aging is potentially described as a disease and that there's a potential cure as we understand the basis and the molecular process that causes aging. And if we can solve that, we can create a much longer health span for the population, lessening the burden on the healthcare system from end-of-life care, as well as enhancing the quality of life of elder citizens in society. And in order to do those things regarding climate change and health innovation, we need computational science in order to solve complex problems. And computational science involves the developments in artificial intelligence, which can be an extraordinarily powerful tool to help us solve the problems of climate change, health innovation, as well as a myriad of other problems that the world face. And so I am hopeful that within the next 10 years, that's the time horizon that I've applied to this idea, that we can get support for establishing this research institute, and that we can get the buy-in for multiple stakeholders. One of the analogies that I would use is the development of the research triangle in North Carolina, which began in a rural area in 1959, and it presently has 300 companies that are in the research triangle, and they bring in $3 to $4 billion annually to the universities involved, North Carolina State, University of North Carolina, and Duke. And this could happen in rural Williamsburg County in South Carolina, and also be instrumental in helping us solve what has to be solved in order for the next generations to have a viable life the problem of climate change. And I'm sure that many of those who have become billionaires, they want a world in the future that their grandchildren can live in. And so they would probably be happy, in my view, to support research that could help us have a better future.
Well,
in response to the question of describe your children and the role that you played as a parent in their development, including your philosophy of parenting, was education a special emphasis? Well, I'll begin with the last part. Education was definitely a special interest, and it was one that we stressed at an early age, especially the importance of getting an education and utilizing that education to further your aims and goals in life. The role that my wife and I played in our children's development was to be very supportive and to convey love unconditionally. We established a kind of homeschooling, even though they were attending the international school in Riyadh, where I was teaching at the university. And once they returned home from school, we would always have a table for them in the dining room set up so that they could have an unrestricted, very quiet area to study and do their homework. And we always required them to do homework first before activities outside. And once they completed their homework, we would have them go and participate in activities such as Boy Scouts, and both of them became Eagle Scouts. They also joined a swim team that was run by the parents, and they became very good swimmers. Starting at the age of 6 and 7, they were in age group swimming, and they swam all the way through college. And that was a very good athletic pursuit. They also pursued the other sports like soccer and also we had a program of going to the desert on the weekends and running usually about 10K runs with a group that was organized for running. And that was a very strenuous exercise for all of us. And we really acquired really good fitness from that program. And the other thing that was important in my parenting, along with my wife, was to give the children free rein about the things that they were interested in and the things that they wanted to pursue. So we would try to expose them to quite a few activities and let them choose the ones that they really were passionate about. And I think that helped them because having that activity along with the academics was a good balance. And in the academic realm, I decided early on that in addition to getting a piano teacher, which they had for a while, and they both pursued music. My oldest son pursued trumpet and baritone, and the youngest pursued violin. I would have them both tutored in particular with a math teacher. There was a math professor at the university where I taught that was willing, once I asked, to give them math lessons every weekend for about an hour and a half. And what we decided to do early on was to reverse engineer the questions that were on this SAT exam. And these were the math questions that normally high school students would be pursuing, but Mark and Jeffrey, they pursued those questions from the 6th grade on. And so that really gave them a really strong background in math, because this math professor gave them all of the ways in which you would approach problem solving that he knew, and he conveyed that over to the children. The other thing about raising the children was really significant was the travel experiences that we had as a family. Over the course of probably about 10 years, we were traveling to quite a few countries, and we would spend maybe about 2 months every year in the summer months traveling in various countries. And when we would go to a given city, we would first locate where the museums were and the parks and the areas of interest to the visitors. And we would also try to blend in locally by eating in the local restaurants and trying to absorb some of the local culture. Overall, over those years, we did about 5 round-the-world trips, which was really a significant boost to their education, in addition to what they acquired at the international school, which was a school that had about 60 nationalities. And so they had friends from countries all over the world. And the curriculum was an American-based curriculum, but it was very rigorous because you had a lot of students from other countries that, requested, additional things that they had from their country's educational systems. I was fortunate to join the board of that school, and I was on the board for about 6 years. That was, I would say, one of my most significant community service activities was to be a board member at the American International School in Riyadh. And that school is a school that was at the peak of its enrollment while I was on the board. It was the largest international school in the world. We had well over 2,500 students. And it was only from grades 1 through K through ninth grade. And that was, the reason for that was that the Saudi government did not allow foreign educational programs to go past the 9th grade. So that required all of the students to go to boarding schools. And my 2 sons went to boarding school in the US after finishing the international school. And they thrived in 2 different boarding schools that I mentioned earlier, and they it really prepared them well for getting into highly selective colleges. My oldest son Mark attended MIT, and my youngest son Jeffrey attended Choate Rosemary Hall, and subsequently Williams College. And Mark, he went to the boarding school Andover, Phillips Academy Andover, and that was the preparation that he made to get entry into MIT. Another question that I wanted to respond to was what are my assessments of the future prospects of African American youth? I think that that's a perilous question about that future, because it has been a big challenge in the educational system to have African American youth thrive at the level that would be optimal. And I think that there are two things that are needed to ensure their excellent future, and that is to have a strong family protocol in African American families to, and this applies to any group of folks, any ethnic group, a nationality. That is really the greatest inspiration starts in the family, and if the parents are well focused on getting their children educated, that can be a major benefit for the future. And I personally benefited from that, and I think my children have benefited from that sort of focus. And the other thing is we need a stronger K through 12 system, particularly in America. I think other countries like Finland, Singapore, and other examples are countries where they have a much stronger K through 12. The U.S. has a very strong university system, and it's actually the best in the world. But the K through 12 system is the one that has the weakest links for our education. And I think that as that is focused to be strengthened, we can have a much better future for African American youth as well as all the youth in the country. In response to the question of what has been one of my favorite vacations and why was it special, I would point out three, because we actually did quite a bit of traveling. And one would be two separate trips that we took to China. One was done early on in the 1985, and at that time, China was really more undeveloped than it is today, and people were still wearing the Mao suits, and essentially was the China of Chairman Mao, and just after the Cultural Revolution. The second trip we took to China was in 2006, I believe, and that was a time when we saw a tremendous change in the country, and that was with a Tai Chi, a group of Tai Chi instructors that we linked up with, and both my wife and I, we started practicing Tai Chi while we were in Saudi Arabia from a teacher from China, and we wanted to expand that knowledge because it was such an interesting area to explore. And we went with a group of Tai Chi instructors, and we went to a lot of the historical places in China of Taoism and the origins of Tai Chi, and that was quite fascinating. One of the highlights, a couple of highlights, was visiting Wudangshan, which is a mountain in Henan, I think, Hubei province, and it is a mountain that has a Taoist temple at the top, and the monks in those temples, they live at the top, and they rarely come down from the mountain, and they basically meditate and practice Tai Chi and go through their philosophical readings on a daily basis. And we were able to observe that when we actually climbed to the top of that mountain. And the other one was the Shaolin Temple, which is a temple that was famous for the Kung Fu martial arts. And they had these enormous schools of Kung Fu students that were learning, and you could see them out on the field, hundreds of them at the same time performing various forms of Kung Fu. The other thing that we saw was the terracotta warriors in Xi'an, which is one of those historical archaeological relics that date back to the earliest dynasties in China, before in the B.C. period. The second place that we enjoyed vacation was Australia. We were able to travel all through Australia. We were in Sydney. We were in Cairns. I was able to scuba dive in the Great Barrier Reef, and we were able to fly across to Darwin, which is in the northern tier of Australia, and then we were able to learn a lot about the Aboriginal cultures and meet a lot of Aboriginals there. And then we took a bus straight down the middle of Australia to Alice Springs. And then from there, we went across to Uluru, which is the Aboriginal term for Ayers Rock, which is a large geological rock formation which has excellent beauty, and it changes colors as the sun sets, and we were able to witness that. And then from there, we took a bus straight across the continent through the Gibson Desert and to Perth, which is in the western side of Australia. So that was a really a very rich experience. And that same summer, we also toured both islands of New Zealand. We started out in the North Island and went across to Wellington from Auckland. And then from Wellington, we crossed over to the South Island and took a train to Christchurch. And that was also a very informative trip. And the third area of vacation was going to the travels we made in Europe, where we were able to take Eurail passes and travel on one of our trips. We did quite a few. One of our trips, we traveled from Malaga in Spain all the way up to Finland over several months. And we were stopping along the way and spending time in various cities and enjoying the places there. And one more place I want to mention particularly is Brazil. My wife and I, we went during Carnival one year, and we were able to see two aspects of Carnival. One was in Bahia, which is the Afrocentric part of Brazil, and that was a fascinating view of Carnival. And then we were in Rio de Janeiro, where we spent time in the Sambadrome to witness the samba schools coming through with their dances and drums and colorful costumes. It was just I would call it the greatest show on earth, and it was the music, all through the night. You could hear drums beating. It was just incredible. And Brazil is a world unto itself. It's a really enormous country, number one, and it has such a diverse population, much like Hawaii or the U.S. And it's a fascinating country that I would recommend to others. So, what would be the most valuable lessons that my parents taught me? And I talked about the parents a little bit earlier, but I wanted to stress that they taught the basics of being a good citizen, honesty, being trustworthy, being generous to others, and also thinking about others beyond thinking about yourself. And I think that those were the kinds of things that my parents really stressed in raising both myself and my sister. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, they stressed education. So one of the things that my father always said was, honesty is the best policy. And when I describe my parents, they were really special people, and I would say I hit the lottery when they became my parents. They, were, I was raised in a 2-parent family, and they were a loving couple, and of course, they had their challenges as a couple, but they stuck together, and that was a good example for both my sister and myself, and that was and they were involved in civic activities as well as very important members of the church. My father was superintendent of schools for a couple of decades, and he was Sunday school superintendent. That's what I meant to say. And every Sunday we would be in church, and he would conduct us the Sunday school, and that was a routine that he followed, as well as his being president of the NAACP at the height of the civil rights movement. So I learned a lot about the importance of civic involvement from them. The other question that was posed was, what has living and working overseas been? How important has that been in my life? Well, I mentioned that my earliest experience was working in a work camp in Africa, and that opened my mind to places beyond the U.S. border. And so, as a result of that, I decided to pursue a lot of my career overseas, and that was really, I think, quite a good decision, because I actually gained an enormous amount of knowledge from the different cultures. We lived in South America and Saudi Arabia most of the time, and did a lot of traveling as well, as we mentioned. But those experiences opened me up to other cultures, and you learn a level of tolerance for things that are different. I always looked at those places that I lived overseas not from a point of view of criticizing things that I didn't agree with, but trying to understand why they did things a certain way, or they had certain cultural patterns. More like an anthropologist that would go into a village and record and understand how these people lived. And that's the way I approached it. And so that was a great benefit, I think. And over the years, I think the family growing up overseas, my kids, my children, and just the incredible experiences that you had, the people we met, and the places that we saw. These were all things that enriched our lives enormously. So I would recommend to people who might get the opportunity to go beyond the borders of the U.S. to work, to really go ahead and do that, because it can really be a very enriching experience for you. Another question is, what are my thoughts about ethics and morality in the modern world? Well, certainly that's one of the weaknesses of society, I believe, is that children are not taught ethics at an early age so that they would do what's right even when nobody's looking. And I think that the problems that we see in the world, the wars, the conflicts, they all generate from a poor knowledge and understanding of ethics. And I think that that's an area that the world could show an enormous amount of improvement. And morality is a combination of ethics and morality. Those are two very important areas that the world needs to put more focus on. I think that the focus can come at the school educational level. It can be a focus in the home with the family, and it could be a focus in schools. Recently at the business schools at the graduate level, they have brought in courses on ethics, because we always look at business as being an area where ethics can be deficient in terms of how people deal with one another. And so we realized that that whole dynamic of business interactions can be improved with all the partners and all of the players and all of the stakeholders having a common view of ethics and the importance of ethics. Another question is, what is a definition of a friend, and what is a good example of a friend? Well, I would say a friend is a person who you can express things that you might not express broadly to people, and ask questions and get advice and get perspectives that could be valuable for you. And you would mutually do that for each other. And those friendships can be lifelong. And I've been fortunate to have acquired lifelong friends that I've made contact and kept contact with over the years, even though we were not in the same geographic area. A good example that I have is a friend that I had in Saudi Arabia who gave me really good advice when I was diagnosed with cancer. And he had experienced the same cancer, and as a result of that friendship, he told me all the things that he experienced and what I need to look out for and what I need to be aware of regarding getting my cancer treated. And that was very helpful. His name was Dr. Gascon. He was a pediatric neurologist, quite accomplished person, and he was a really good friend. Unfortunately, he passed about 3 years ago. The other question that I wanted to respond to is what are my favorite health tips? I would say that it's very, very important that people focus on their health from an early age and do the basics, what we might call the usual suspects. Do the basics from an early age on a consistent basis. In other words, develop the habits of health. And those involve around having a really good diet. That's, I would say, based on my experience and the research that I've done, it would be predominantly plant-based, but that's not to exclude the fishes and the chickens and the meats, but the majority of your food should be fruits and vegetables, if you wanted to look at a percentage. And I think that would really be a really big boost to everybody's health. The other part is movement. The body is designed with your muscular system to move. And so you have to get an exercise regime which really is compatible with your age and with your abilities. And you must follow that. You should follow that on a regular basis. That is also going to really be helpful. And the research also bears that out, that this is really, really a good way to stay healthy. Now, when we get into the more technical aspects of health, which fortunately I've done quite a bit of research into this, we have certain metabolic pathways which are protective for the body, and you want to actually activate those. In our modern sedentary society where people eat more than they need to eat, and not only more than they need, but not necessarily the best things to eat. It has been found in the research that if we focus on really quality nutrition at a low calorie level, and then focus on something a lot of the researchers are are bringing out now, are bringing to the fore now, intermittent fasting, where you create a window of eating which is a bit narrower than the one that people normally have. In other words, you take 6 to 8 hours and you say, I'm going to eat during these 6 to 8 hours, and then the other hours we're not going to eat. The research has revealed that this can be beneficial. Not everybody might not want to do that, but those are some of the things that can activate those normally dormant metabolic pathways that protect the body. And so you want to, especially as we get older, we want to really protect the body as much as we can, because that can really actually slow down the aging process. And as the research, continues, they will actually have various medications that you can take that can slow down and potentially in the future reverse aging. So that's something that you want to keep your body healthy to benefit from. We call it a bridge to a bridge to a bridge. You bridge yourself to the next technology, which can then rejuvenate you, and then that technology can bridge you to the more advanced technology in the future, which can really be protective. And so what that means is that we will focus on health span. At the present day, what happens is people tend to decline very rapidly as they reach the 60s and 70s. What we want is for you to be robust straight through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so that you can be active, you can be, you can be sharp in your thinking, and all those benefits that you get from having good health. Because if you get old and you're declining rapidly, and you have a lot of disablements, then it's not really going to be a pleasant experience. Even though you got all the wisdom or all the years and the legacy knowledge that you've acquired, and you got grandchildren you're trying to influence, you want to be healthy to do that. So those are my basic health tips. My definition of success, that's a question that was asked, and I would say that success is really your idea of how you have accomplished something that you have pursued as a goal. And if you're really fortunate, you can have enormous success and have things that would accrue from that the world might recognize. But even if it's only yourself and within your family, you reach certain goals, such as getting an advanced degree or getting a promotion in your work, or establishing a business that becomes successful, or doing some physical activity that you wanted to do, like take a long bike trip, or climbing a mountain if you want, or traveling to certain countries. I would consider all those successes. And successes is what I would describe like happiness is all in the spectrum. It's a range. You can have small successes, you can have medium successes, and you can have large successes.
You're close to segueing into the last question, which is what 3 ideas from your own experiences you would like to impart to future generations?
Well, I would say that the number one idea is to get an education.
Okay.
and along with that, be a lifelong learner, right? And so, so in that context, I would say to future generations, consider multiple professions that AI cannot take away from you. And so that is something that someone planning their life and career as we go forward, they need to consider very carefully, because people are gonna, if you look at lifespans in the beginning of the 1800s, in the 19th century, say 1801, between that and now, at that point, the average lifespan was like 35 to 40 years old. And lifespan has expanded to 80 now, roughly, 70s, 80s. Over the next relatively short time, it's going to expand over 100. And also with the advances in the science of basically solving aging as an issue, and looking at aging as basically a disease that can be cured. People are going to live a lot longer. So people need to be thinking about more than one career. And basically, that's kind of by accident in a way. I sort of pursue things by doing multiple things over time. And so that's the advice that I would give, is to pursue multiple careers, think about multiple careers early on, and also consider family as most important. Your family and how you relate to them and what you do for them and appreciating them, that is very important. And that means that you should choose your spouse wisely,
Well, let me just say that this has been a privilege to listen to you and to be on this journey with you for the last hour and a half. So I'm just thankful that we were able to get you on video, because that would have been a real something that we would have missed if we hadn't done this. So I
want to add one thing, Ron, to the question you asked about marriage.
Okay,
I just want to list a few things that are important for marriage.
Go ahead. The tape is still running.
Friendship, trust, respect for each other, teamwork, honesty, mutual support, bring out the best in each other, talk about goals and objectives and pursuits. Time spent together is so important. And compromise, open communication, equality, and unconditional love.
Well, one last question. Since you were the interviewer, how does it feel to be the interviewee?
I think it's great, because you have to keep in mind that I've probably interviewed over, say, 100 people with a very extensive list that I gave you, and I would say that I've learned just listening to all of these interviews. Right, I've learned a lot about what other people's experiences are, and I think it's been a huge benefit to me, and it's actually given me answers to some of these very questions from listening to what other people have said. So I'm really happy that you have suggested doing this interview with me, and it has given me a chance to say a lot of things that I would be thinking about while people are answering their questions. And I'm thinking about, well, what would I be saying? Well, you've really given me the opportunity to do this, and I appreciate that immensely.
Well, it's my privilege, and you'll get a copy of this as soon as I figure out how to send it to you. So look, you have a good day, and let's stay in touch. You know, let's not make this the last
All
time
right.
we do video. Can you?
We can do this without having an interview, just to keep each other up to date on stuff, okay?
Absolutely. Okay.
All right, thanks again, man.
Hey.
And have a wonderful day and a good, wonderful weekend.
Same to you.
My wife, my sister is celebrating her 85th birthday tomorrow, so we got a big Zoom that we're gonna be doing tomorrow to celebrate her 85th birthday.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
All
Take
right.
care. Okay.
Take care. All right.